The glass shattered on the marble floor before anyone even noticed Maria Alvarez standing near the back wall of the grand hall. It was not her fault. A waiter had bumped into a cart, and the sound of breaking crystal cut through the low hum of violin music like a gunshot in a quiet church. Heads turned. For one sharp second, every eye in the room searched for someone to blame. And Maria, holding her cleaning cart just a few feet away, felt the weight of 100 stares land on her shoulders even though her hands had touched nothing. She was 52 years old, with silver streaks running through her dark hair, and hands that had scrubbed floors, wiped counters, and polished silverware for more than a decade inside this very building. The Rosewood Community Hall was known across the city for hosting the wealthiest charity events of the season, and tonight was no different. Diamonds sparkled under the chandeliers, perfume mixed with the smell of expensive wine. Laughter rose and fell in practiced, confident waves. Maria was invisible to most of the guests, the way a lamp or a painting on the wall is invisible, present but unseen, useful but unnoticed. She quickly bent down, picked up the broken pieces of glass with a small dustpan she always carried, and moved on without a word. This was her job, and she had learned long ago that the fastest way to survive an evening like this was to stay quiet, stay fast, and stay out of sight. Her manager, a tall man named Daniel Whitcomb, had told her that morning that the hall needed to shine tonight because important donors were arriving. People who could write checks large enough to fund an entire year of charity work with a single signature. Maria did not mind the long hours. She needed the money. Her small apartment on the edge of the city was falling behind on rent, and her son was studying hard in college, hoping to become an engineer, a dream she had promised herself she would help him reach no matter what it cost her. She had given up many things in her life for the people she loved, and she had stopped counting the sacrifices a long time ago. As she pushed her cart toward the far corner of the hall to collect used napkins and empty glasses, her eyes landed on something that made her pause, just for a moment. In the corner, half hidden behind a velvet curtain and a stack of folded chairs, sat an old grand piano. Its polished black surface was dusty in places, its keys slightly yellowed with age, and one of its legs looked as though it had been repaired more than once. It was not part of tonight's decoration. It was simply there, forgotten, the way old things often are when newer, shinier things take their place. Maria had noticed that piano many times before during her years of cleaning this hall late at night after events ended. She always found herself lingering near it, running a soft cloth over its surface a little slower than necessary, careful never to touch the keys. Tonight, something about the way the chandelier light hit its curved edge made her stop completely. Cart forgotten, hand resting lightly on the cold marble floor beside it. She did not notice that someone was watching her. Richard Colton stood a few feet away, a glass of champagne in his hand, his tailored suit fitting him with the kind of perfection that only money can buy. He was in his early 40s, confident in the way men become when they have never once been told no, and he had spent the last 20 minutes growing bored of the polite small talk surrounding him. He noticed the cleaning woman staring at the old piano with an expression he found strange, almost hungry, the way a child looks at a toy in a shop window. He nudged his friend beside him, a woman named Grace Whitfield who worked in event planning and had helped organize tonight's gala. Grace was kind by nature, but she was also tired, and tired people sometimes laugh at things they normally would not. "Look at that," Richard said quietly, nodding toward Maria. "She looks like she wants to play it." Grace glanced over, unsure what to say. "Maybe she does," Grace replied, though there was no real weight behind her words, just something to fill the silence. Richard's smile widened into something sharper. An idea had formed in his mind, the kind of idea that seemed harmless to him, but would soon prove to be anything but. He crossed the room in a few easy strides, his shoes clicking against the marble, and stopped just behind Maria, who straightened quickly when she realized someone important was standing close to her. "I am sorry, sir," she said immediately, stepping back from the piano as though she had been caught doing something wrong. "I was just cleaning around it." Richard raised a hand, waving away her apology with the casual confidence of someone who had never worried about being misunderstood. "No need to apologize," he said smoothly. "In fact, I have a wonderful idea. Why don't you play us something?" For a moment, Maria was certain she had misheard him. "Play, sir?" "The piano," Richard said, gesturing toward it with his champagne glass. "You were staring at it like an old friend. Go on, give us a little show." A few nearby guests turned their heads, drawn by the sudden shift in Richard's tone, the kind of tone that promised entertainment. Grace felt a small twist of discomfort in her stomach but said nothing, unsure how to stop what was clearly building into something uncomfortable. Maria felt her face grow warm. She understood immediately what this was. It was not an invitation born from kindness or curiosity. It was a joke. one crafted at her expense, meant to entertain wealthy guests bored of speeches and small talk. She had seen this kind of moment before in other forms, moments where people with power decided that someone without power existed simply to provide amusement. "I am not a musician, sir," she said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. "I should get back to my work." But Richard was not finished. He turned slightly, raising his voice just enough for a small circle of guests to hear him clearly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced with theatrical flair, "we have a hidden talent among us tonight. Our very own cleaning staff would like to entertain us with a piano performance." Laughter rippled through the small crowd that had gathered, some genuine, some simply polite, but all of it landing on Maria like small stones. She felt her chest tighten. She thought of turning and walking away, pushing her cart back into the shadows where she belonged according to the unspoken rules of this world. But something else stirred inside her too, something old and quiet that had been sleeping for many years. She looked at the piano again, really looked at it this time, at its worn keys and its dusty lid, and for a brief moment, the noise of the room faded into the background. She remembered another room decades ago, filled not with wealthy strangers but with the warm light of a small practice hall, where a much younger version of herself had once sat at a piano just like this one, fingers trembling with excitement rather than fear, a future stretching out before her like an open road. That memory had been buried so deeply, tucked beneath years of work, worry, and survival, that she had almost convinced herself it belonged to someone else entirely. Richard clapped his hands together once, drawing more attention. "Come now," he said, his tone dripping with false encouragement. "Do not be shy. We are all friends here." More guests gathered now, phones rising slowly from pockets and purses, ready to capture whatever awkward, entertaining moment was about to unfold. Grace shifted uncomfortably beside Richard, glancing toward Maria with something close to sympathy, but she said nothing to stop it, caught in the same silence that so often protects cruelty simply by allowing it to continue unchallenged. Maria's hands tightened around the handle of her cleaning cart. She could feel her heartbeat quicken, not entirely from fear, but from something else stirring beneath it, something that felt dangerously close to defiance. She thought of her son studying late into the night, of the years she had spent quietly accepting smaller portions of respect than she deserved, and something inside her, small but stubborn, refused to shrink any further. She released the cart. The small crowd murmured in surprise as Maria stepped toward the piano bench, her simple black uniform a stark contrast against the elegant gowns and tailored suits surrounding her. Richard's smile grew wider, certain he was about to witness a moment of clumsy embarrassment that he could laugh about with his friends for weeks to come. He had no idea what was actually about to happen. Maria reached the bench and paused, her fingers hovering just above the keys. The room seemed to hold its breath, phones angled, eyes locked, whispers fading into an expectant hush. Somewhere behind her, she heard someone chuckle softly, already anticipating failure. She closed her eyes for a single second, and in that darkness, she found something she had not touched in over 20 years, a version of herself she had almost forgotten existed. Then, slowly, she sat down. The bench creaked beneath her weight, an old, tired sound that seemed to echo through the sudden silence of the hall. Maria placed her hands gently on the keys, feeling their familiar coolness beneath her fingertips, a sensation that struck her chest with unexpected force. It had been so long. She had told herself so many times that this part of her life was over, sealed away behind responsibility and survival, yet here it was, waiting patiently beneath her fingers, as though no time had passed at all. Richard leaned toward Grace, whispering something that made her force a polite smile, though her eyes remained fixed on Maria with growing uncertainty. Somewhere near the back of the crowd, a young waiter paused mid-step, tray balanced carefully in his hands, curious despite himself. Maria took a slow breath. The room was silent now, the kind of silence that feels heavier than sound, filled with judgment, curiosity, and quiet cruelty all tangled together. She could feel the weight of every stare, every unspoken assumption about who she was and what she was capable of. For a brief moment, doubt crept into her mind, the same doubt that had convinced her years ago to abandon this path entirely, the same voice that had once told her that dreams like this were not meant for women like her. But beneath that doubt was something stronger, something that had been quietly building inside her since the moment Richard had first spoken those mocking words. It was not anger exactly, though anger was part of it. It was something closer to remembrance, a reminder of who she had once been before life had asked her to become someone smaller, someone quieter, someone easier to overlook. Her fingers trembled slightly above the keys. Then, without announcement, without hesitation, she began to play. The first notes rang out into the hall, soft and uncertain at first, as though testing the air around them. A few guests exchanged amused glances, clearly expecting the fumbling attempt of someone who had never truly learned the instrument. Richard's smile remained fixed, waiting for the punchline he was certain would arrive within seconds. But the notes did not fumble. They grew steadier with each passing second, rising gently into the space above the crowd, carrying with them a quiet confidence that seemed entirely out of place coming from a woman in a plain cleaning uniform. The amused glances around the room began to shift, ever so slightly, into something closer to confusion. Maria's eyes remained closed, her body swaying softly with the rhythm building beneath her hands. The years fell away from her one by one with each key she pressed, each note pulling her further from the marble floors and endless hours of quiet labor, and closer to a version of herself she had thought was lost forever. The old piano, despite its slightly imperfect tuning, responded to her touch as though it recognized an old friend returning home. Its worn keys, dulled by years of neglect, seemed to brighten beneath her fingers, filling the grand hall with a sound far richer and far more beautiful than anyone standing there had expected. Richard's smile faltered. Grace's polite expression slowly melted into something closer to astonishment. Around the room, phones that had been raised in anticipation of mockery now hovered, forgotten, as their owners stared instead with wide, unblinking eyes. The laughter that had filled the space just moments earlier had disappeared entirely, replaced by a silence far different from the mocking hush that had come before it. This silence was reverent, almost sacred, the kind that settles over a room when something unexpected and extraordinary begins to unfold. Maria did not notice any of it. In that moment, she was not standing in a crowded charity gala surrounded by wealthy strangers. She was somewhere else entirely, somewhere warm and familiar, a place built from memory and longing that she had carried quietly inside her for over 2 decades without ever daring to visit again. And as her fingers continued moving across the keys, carrying the entire hall along with her into that hidden place, no one in the room, not Richard, not Grace, not a single guest standing frozen in stunned silence, had any idea just how far this single, unexpected performance was about to change everything. The melody deepened as Maria's hands moved with growing certainty across the keys, each phrase spilling into the next like water finding its natural path down a hillside. The notes were not simple. They rose and fell in complex patterns, weaving together in a way that only someone with years of serious training could achieve, and the entire room now stood frozen in a silence that felt almost physical, pressing against every guest gathered near the piano. Grace Whitfield had taken a small step closer, her champagne glass forgotten in her hand, condensation dripping unnoticed onto the marble floor. She had grown up around classical music, had spent years attending recitals with her parents as a child, and something in her recognized immediately that what she was hearing was not the work of an amateur. This was the sound of someone who had once studied seriously, who had once dedicated countless hours to mastering an instrument most people only ever admired from a distance. Richard Colton stood completely still, his earlier smirk replaced by an expression he could not quite name. He had expected laughter. He had expected fumbling, awkward notes and red-faced embarrassment, something he could recount later at other gatherings as a funny story about the night the cleaning woman tried to play piano. Instead, he found himself standing motionless, his champagne slowly warming in his hand, unable to look away from the woman seated at the bench. Around them, more guests began drifting closer, drawn by the sound the way moths are drawn toward light. Conversations that had been happening at the edges of the hall slowly died away as people turned to see what was happening. Servers paused mid-step, trays balanced carefully in their hands, eyes fixed on the small woman whose fingers moved with such graceful precision across the aging keys. Maria remained lost within the music, unaware of the growing crowd forming around her. Her mind had drifted far from the grand hall, far from the judgmental stares and mocking laughter that had greeted her only minutes earlier. She was somewhere else now, somewhere built from memory, where the air smelled faintly of rosin and polished wood, where an old teacher's voice still echoed gently in her mind. She remembered him clearly now, a patient man named Edward Bryant who had taught piano out of a modest studio near her childhood home. He had recognized something special in her when she was only 11 years old, a raw and untrained talent that needed careful shaping. He had told her parents, with quiet conviction, that their daughter possessed a gift rarely seen, one that deserved every opportunity to grow. For years, Maria had trained under his guidance, spending countless afternoons after school seated at a piano much like the one beneath her fingers now, practicing scales until her hands ached, then moving on to more complex pieces that challenged not just her technical skill, but her emotional depth. She remembered the pride in her mother's eyes during her first recital, the nervous excitement that had buzzed through her chest before she ever placed her fingers on the keys in front of an audience for the very first time. By the time she turned 17, Maria had become one of the most promising young pianists in her region, earning recognition in local competitions, and eventually catching the attention of a prestigious music conservatory. She had received a formal invitation to audition for a scholarship program, an opportunity that could have changed the entire trajectory of her life, opening doors to concert halls and international stages that most musicians only ever dreamed of reaching. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Her mother had fallen seriously ill just months before the scheduled audition, a sudden and severe illness that required constant care and expensive treatment her family could not easily afford. Maria, the eldest of 3 children, had been the only one old enough to help carry the weight of what followed. She had spent her days at her mother's bedside and her nights working small jobs to help cover mounting medical bills, her piano practice slowly fading into the background of a life suddenly consumed by responsibility. The audition date arrived and passed without her ever stepping foot inside the conservatory. She remembered writing a short letter of apology, explaining as best she could why she could not attend, and mailing it with hands that trembled not from nerves but from grief over a dream she was watching slip quietly away. Her mother recovered eventually, though the illness left the family with debts that took years to repay. By then, Maria had grown accustomed to a different kind of life, one built around survival rather than artistry. She took whatever work she could find, first in a small shop, later cleaning offices and event halls, always telling herself that music had simply been a chapter of her youth, something beautiful but ultimately impractical, a luxury she could no longer afford to pursue. She married young, had her son, and poured the same discipline she once used at the piano into raising him well, determined that he would have opportunities she never got the chance to claim for herself. The piano itself had become something she rarely allowed herself to think about, a closed door she walked past without ever reaching for the handle, afraid of what she might feel if she opened it again. Until tonight. As her fingers moved across the old grand piano in the corner of Rosewood Hall, Maria felt every one of those buried years rising to the surface at once, decades of quiet longing pouring out through a melody she had not consciously chosen, but that had emerged from somewhere deep and unspoken within her. The piece she played was not one she had rehearsed recently, it was simply there, waiting patiently inside her fingers all along, a piece she had once performed during her final recital, before her mother's illness had changed everything. The music swelled gently, carrying with it every emotion Maria had never allowed herself to fully express, grief over a dream deferred, gratitude for the family she had built instead, quiet pride in the sacrifices she had made without complaint, and beneath it all, a stubborn flicker of hope that had somehow survived, despite everything life had asked her to give up. Around her, the crowd continued to grow. What had begun as a small circle of amused onlookers had transformed into a dense gathering of nearly the entire hall, guests abandoning their conversations entirely, to witness what was quickly becoming the most talked-about moment of the evening. Whispers passed quietly between them, questions with no clear answers. Who is she? How does she know how to play like that? Is this some kind of surprise performance arranged for the event? Daniel Whitcomb, Maria's manager, had heard the sudden hush fall over the hall from where he stood near the catering tables, and he made his way through the crowd with growing concern, wondering if something had gone wrong. When he finally reached a clear view of the piano and saw Maria seated there, fingers moving with practiced elegance across the keys, his concern shifted immediately into stunned disbelief. He had employed Maria for over 10 years and had never once heard her mention anything about playing music, let alone playing with this level of skill. He stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, unable to move, unable to look away, watching the woman he had only ever known as quiet, hard-working, and unassuming transform before his eyes into someone entirely different, someone whose fingers carried the unmistakable mark of years of serious training. Grace leaned toward Richard, her voice barely above a whisper, though the silence in the room made it easy enough to hear. "This is not a joke anymore," she said quietly. Richard did not respond. His eyes remained fixed on Maria, his earlier arrogance slowly curdling into something closer to shame, though he was not yet ready to admit it fully to himself. As the piece continued, Maria's shoulders began to move more freely, her body no longer stiff with the caution of someone trying to remain unnoticed, but instead loosening into the natural rhythm of a performer fully immersed in her craft. Her foot pressed gently against the pedal at just the right moments, a technical habit so deeply ingrained that it required no conscious thought at all, muscle memory reaching back across more than 2 decades to guide her seamlessly through a piece she had not touched in years. Somewhere near the back of the hall, an elderly man named Edward Bryant, invited that evening as a donor and longtime supporter of the arts, paused mid-conversation as the sound reached his ears. He turned slowly, his brow furrowing in confusion, as something familiar tugged gently at the edges of his memory. He excused himself from the small group he had been speaking with, and moved carefully through the crowd, drawn forward by a melody that felt strangely, impossibly familiar to him. As he reached a clear vantage point and saw the woman seated at the piano, his breath caught sharply in his throat. It could not be, he thought to himself, blinking rapidly as though trying to clear his vision. It had been more than 20 years, but something in the shape of her hands, the particular way she leaned slightly forward during the more intense passages of the piece, stirred a memory buried deep within him, one he had not thought about in a very long time. He remained silent for now, watching carefully, waiting to be certain before he allowed himself to believe what his instincts were already telling him. The music continued to build, rising toward its emotional peak, and the entire hall seemed to hold its breath together, guests and staff alike caught in the same unexpected spell. Phones that had once been raised in anticipation of mockery now recorded something entirely different, capturing a moment that none of them fully understood yet, but all of them recognized as significant. Maria's fingers pressed firmly into a series of powerful chords, the sound crashing gently through the hall like waves against a familiar shore, before softening once again into a delicate, quiet passage that seemed to whisper rather than speak. Tears gathered unexpectedly in the eyes of several guests standing nearby, moved by an emotional depth they had not anticipated finding at a formal charity gala, surrounded by marble floors and polished silverware. Richard felt something shift uncomfortably in his chest as he watched her, an emotion he was unaccustomed to feeling and even less accustomed to acknowledging. He glanced around at the faces surrounding him, all captivated, all transformed by the very woman he had summoned to this piano moments earlier intending to provoke laughter at her expense. The realization settled over him slowly, heavily, that whatever this moment had become, it was no longer anything close to the joke he had originally intended. Near the piano, Daniel Whitcomb finally found his voice again, turning quietly to a nearby staff member. "Get the hall director," he whispered urgently. "Get him now." But no one moved quickly enough to interrupt what was unfolding. No one wanted to break whatever spell had settled so completely over the room. Maria played on, unaware of the growing recognition rippling through the crowd around her, unaware of Edward Bryant's widening eyes as memory slowly resolved into certainty, unaware that the joke Richard had intended just minutes earlier had already transformed into something the entire hall would be discussing for weeks, perhaps months, to come. For Maria, none of that mattered yet. In this moment, there was only the music, only the keys beneath her fingers, only the quiet, aching joy of finally, after more than 2 decades, allowing herself to remember exactly who she had once been. The final chord rang out and hung in the air for a long moment before fading into silence, and for a full 3 seconds, nobody in the hall made a sound at all. Maria's hands rested gently on the keys, her chest rising and falling with the effort of the performance, her eyes still closed as though she were reluctant to leave the world she had briefly returned to. Then, all at once, the silence broke. Applause erupted through the hall like a sudden storm, guests clapping fiercely, some rising from their seats near the edges of the room, others calling out words of praise that blended together into an overwhelming wave of sound. Maria's eyes opened slowly, and she blinked in confusion at the sight before her, a sea of faces she did not recognize, all turned toward her, all reacting with an intensity she had never expected. For a moment, she felt a flicker of panic. She had forgotten, in the depth of the music, that she was standing in the middle of a formal event, surrounded by wealthy strangers who moments earlier had gathered only to watch her fail. She rose quickly from the bench, smoothing down her uniform with nervous hands, unsure whether to bow, apologize, or simply return quietly to her cart and disappear into the background where she had always felt safest. But before she could decide, a voice called out from the crowd, clear and trembling with emotion. "Maria Alvarez." She froze at the sound of her own name spoken with such certainty by a stranger. Her eyes searched the crowd until they landed on an elderly man making his way toward her, his steps quick despite his age, his expression a mixture of disbelief and joy that seemed almost too large for his face to contain. It took her several seconds to recognize him, the years having changed his features considerably, but as he drew closer, something in the shape of his eyes and the gentle way he carried himself sparked a memory buried deep within her. "Mr. Bryant," she whispered, her hand rising instinctively to cover her mouth. Edward Bryant stopped just a few feet away from her, tears gathering openly in his eyes. "I knew it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I knew that sound. I would recognize your playing anywhere, even after all these years. The crowd around them, still buzzing with excited whispers, quieted again as they sensed something significant unfolding. A story beginning to reveal itself in real time before their eyes. Grace Whitfield stepped closer, her curiosity outweighing her earlier discomfort, eager to understand the connection between this humble cleaning woman and the respected elderly gentleman known throughout the city for his generous support of young musicians. You taught piano, Maria said softly, still trying to process the reality of the moment. Near my childhood home, I was your student for almost 6 years. Edward nodded, reaching out to take her hands gently in his own weathered palms. You were more than a student, Maria, he said. You were the most talented pupil I ever had the privilege of teaching. I always wondered what became of you after you stopped coming to lessons. I searched for you for years afterward, hoping to hear that you had made it to the conservatory, that you were performing somewhere in the world. Maria felt her throat tighten, old memories rising quickly to the surface alongside fresh tears she struggled to hold back. My mother became very ill, she explained quietly, the words tumbling out now that the truth had finally found an opening. I had to miss the audition. There was no one else to care for her, and after that, life simply moved in a different direction. I never had the chance to return to it. The crowd around them had grown almost completely silent now, captivated by the unfolding story, phones still recording, though the mood had shifted entirely from mockery to something closer to reverence. Richard Colton stood at the edge of the gathering, his face pale, the champagne glass now completely forgotten in his hand. He listened as the pieces of Maria's history assembled themselves before him, each detail deepening the shame settling heavily in his chest. Edward turned toward the surrounding guests, his voice rising slightly so that everyone nearby could hear him clearly. This woman, he announced, gesturing toward Maria with obvious pride, was one of the most gifted young pianists I have ever encountered in more than 40 years of teaching. She was offered a place in one of the most prestigious music programs in the region, an opportunity that very few students ever receive. Murmurs of astonishment rippled through the crowd, guests turning to look at one another in disbelief, many glancing toward Richard with expressions that made his discomfort even harder to ignore. Grace placed a gentle hand on his arm, though whether it was meant as comfort or a quiet warning, even she was not entirely certain. Maria shook her head slightly, feeling suddenly overwhelmed by the attention now surrounding her. I am not that person anymore. I clean this hall. That is my job, and I am grateful for it. But Edward's expression remained firm, filled with a conviction that left no room for argument. Talent like yours does not simply disappear, Maria, he said. It only waits for the right moment to return, and tonight, it clearly has. A woman standing nearby, elegantly dressed in deep green silk, stepped forward hesitantly, clearing her throat before speaking. Excuse me, she said, addressing Maria directly. I could not help but overhear. My name is Charlotte Ainsworth, and I sit on the board of the City Philharmonic Society. I have rarely heard anyone play with such feeling. Have you truly not performed in over 20 years? Maria nodded, still visibly shaken by the sudden shift in attention. Not since I was 17, she admitted. I stopped practicing seriously after that. There simply was not time, between raising my son and working to support my family. Charlotte exchanged a brief glance with Edward, something unspoken passing between them, before turning back toward Maria with growing excitement. What you just played tonight, she said carefully, was not the performance of someone who has been away from music for 20 years. That was the playing of someone who has kept it alive inside her, even without realizing it. Around them, the crowd began to grow again, as word spread quickly through the hall about what had just occurred. Guests who had missed the initial performance pressed closer, eager to hear the story now unfolding, while those who had witnessed it firsthand excitedly recounted the details to newcomers, each retelling growing slightly more dramatic than the last. Daniel Whitcomb finally reached Maria's side, having pushed his way gently through the crowd, his expression a complicated mixture of concern and amazement. Maria, he said quietly, are you all right? I had no idea you could play like that. Maria offered him a small, tired smile. Neither did I, she admitted honestly, until tonight. Richard, still standing near the edge of the gathering, finally forced himself to step forward, his earlier confidence completely gone, replaced by something far more humble. He cleared his throat awkwardly, drawing Maria's attention toward him for the first time since the applause had begun. I owe you an apology, he said, his voice noticeably quieter than it had been earlier in the evening. What I did was unkind. I asked you to play thinking it would embarrass you, and instead, you reminded this entire room what real talent looks like. I am sorry, truly. Maria studied him for a long moment, weighing his words carefully before responding. Apology accepted, she said simply. her tone calm rather than bitter. "Sometimes the moments we least expect end up teaching us the most." Richard nodded, clearly humbled, though he said nothing further, stepping back to allow Edward and Charlotte to continue their conversation with Maria uninterrupted. Charlotte tilted her head thoughtfully, studying Maria with growing interest. "I would like to offer you an opportunity," she said carefully. "The Philharmonic Society hosts an annual showcase for emerging and returning talent. I believe you would be an extraordinary addition, if you are willing to consider it." Maria's eyes widened in surprise, old fears rushing quickly to the surface alongside a flicker of something she had not allowed herself to feel in decades, genuine hope. "I do not know," she said hesitantly. "It has been so long. I am not sure I still have what it takes to perform on a real stage." Edward placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his expression warm and steady. "You just performed on one," he said gently, gesturing toward the crowd still gathered around them. "This hall may not have been built for concerts, but tonight, it certainly felt like one." Maria glanced around at the sea of faces surrounding her, guests who only an hour earlier had not known her name, now watching her with genuine admiration and respect. She thought briefly of her son, studying diligently in his dorm room across the city, unaware that his mother had just rediscovered a piece of herself she had long believed was lost forever. She thought of her own mother, whose illness had once forced her away from this very path, and wondered, with a strange mixture of grief and gratitude, what she might think if she could see her daughter now. "I will think about it," Maria said finally, her voice steady despite the emotion swirling within her. "Thank you truly for this opportunity." Charlotte smiled warmly, reaching into her small clutch purse to retrieve a business card, which she pressed gently into Maria's hand. "Please do consider it," she said sincerely. "Talent like yours deserves to be heard, not hidden away." As the crowd slowly began to disperse, conversations buzzing excitedly around the hall about the unexpected performance they had just witnessed, Daniel gently guided Maria toward a quieter corner, away from the remaining onlookers, allowing her a moment to catch her breath after the whirlwind of emotion that had just unfolded. "You should sit down for a moment," he said kindly, pulling a nearby chair toward her. "That was a lot, even for someone as strong as you." Maria sank gratefully into the chair, her hands trembling slightly, as the adrenaline of the moment began to fade. "I have not thought about playing in so long," she admitted quietly. "I convinced myself that part of my life was over completely." Daniel studied her carefully for a moment before responding. "Maybe it was simply waiting," he said thoughtfully. "Some things do not disappear. They just get quiet for a while." Nearby, Edward and Charlotte continued speaking in low, excited tones, already discussing the possibility of arranging a formal audition, their enthusiasm evident in the animated way they gestured toward one another. Richard lingered a short distance away, watching the scene with an expression that had shifted from shame into something closer to quiet reflection, clearly reconsidering assumptions he had carried carelessly into the evening. As the hall slowly returned to its usual rhythm of quiet conversation and soft background music, the old grand piano remained at the center of attention, no longer forgotten in its dusty corner but suddenly transformed into something significant, a silent witness to the moment everything had changed for Maria Alvarez. She glanced toward it one final time before rising slowly from her chair, feeling something shift deep within her chest, a door she had believed permanently closed now standing open once again, waiting patiently for her to decide whether she was ready to walk back through it. Across the room, a young woman in a simple gray dress approached Daniel quietly. She introduced herself as a local reporter named Isabel Carter, who had been covering the charity gala for a small community newspaper and had witnessed the entire performance from near the entrance of the hall. She asked, with careful politeness, whether she might have a brief word with Maria about what had just happened. Daniel glanced toward Maria, silently asking whether she felt ready for any further attention tonight. Maria hesitated only a moment before nodding, curiosity outweighing her exhaustion. She had spent so many years staying invisible that the idea of someone wanting to hear her story felt both frightening and, in a quiet way, deeply welcome. Isabel knelt slightly beside the chair, notebook in hand, though she kept her questions gentle rather than intrusive. She asked how long Maria had worked at the hall, how she had first learned to play, and what had gone through her mind in the moments before she sat down at the piano. Maria answered honestly, her voice steady despite the strangeness of being asked such personal questions by someone she had never met. "It was not really a decision," Maria explained quietly. "It was more like something inside me finally spoke up after staying quiet for a very long time." Isabel wrote quickly, clearly moved by the simplicity and honesty of the answer. She thanked Maria warmly before stepping away to speak briefly with Edward and Charlotte, Gathering additional context for what she already suspected would become a much larger story than a simple charity gala update. As the evening wound down and guests slowly began collecting their coats, the earlier laughter and mockery that had greeted Maria hours before felt almost impossible to imagine now. Several guests approached her directly before leaving, offering quiet words of admiration, a few even asking, somewhat sheepishly, whether they might have recorded a portion of her performance to share with friends who had missed the event entirely. Maria accepted each compliment with quiet grace, though the attention still felt unfamiliar, like wearing a coat that did not quite fit yet. She thought often, throughout the remainder of the evening, of her son, wishing briefly that he could have been present to witness the moment his mother had unexpectedly stepped back into a version of herself he had never known existed. By the time the last guest departed and the hall grew quiet again, Maria found herself standing once more beside the old piano, running her fingers lightly across its worn surface, the way she had done so many times before while cleaning, except now the gesture carried an entirely different meaning. It was no longer simply an object she cared for from a distance. It had become, once again, something deeply hers. Daniel approached quietly, offering to help her finish the remaining cleanup so she could head home earlier than usual. "Take the night off from worrying," he said kindly. "You earned that much tonight, at the very least." Maria smiled softly, grateful for the small kindness, though her mind remained occupied with everything that had unfolded. She tucked Charlotte's business card carefully into her pocket, uncertain yet what she planned to do with it, but unwilling, for the first time in many years, to simply throw the opportunity away without at least considering it seriously. As she gathered her belongings and prepared to leave the hall, she paused once more at the entrance, glancing back toward the piano standing quietly in its corner, moonlight now spilling gently across its polished surface through the tall windows nearby. She thought of her old teacher's words, spoken with such conviction only hours earlier, that talent like hers did not simply disappear. It only waited patiently for the right moment to return. For the first time in over 20 years, walking out into the cool night air, Maria allowed herself to wonder, quietly and cautiously, what that return might actually look like. 3 days after the gala, Maria stood in her small kitchen preparing breakfast when her phone buzzed against the counter with a message from a number she did not recognize. She wiped her hands on a towel and opened it cautiously, half expecting a wrong number or an advertisement. Instead, the message was from Isabel Carter, the reporter who had spoken with her briefly at the hall. "The article was published this morning," the message read. "It has already been shared more than anyone expected. I thought you should see it before someone else shows you." Maria opened the link with trembling fingers, unsure what to expect. The headline stretched across the top of the page in bold letters, describing a cleaning woman whose hidden talent had silenced an entire room of wealthy guests. Beneath it sat a photograph taken during her performance, her eyes closed, her hands moving gracefully across the keys, captured in a moment she had not even realized anyone was photographing so closely. She scrolled through the article slowly, reading Isabel's careful retelling of the evening, the mocking invitation, the stunned silence, Edward Bryant's emotional recognition, and the quiet dignity with which Maria had accepted both the earlier humiliation and the later admiration. The piece ended with a simple line that made Maria's chest tighten unexpectedly, describing her not as a cleaning woman with a surprising talent, but as an artist whose gift had simply been waiting for the world to notice. Her son, Lucas, called less than an hour later, his voice practically shaking with excitement through the phone. "Mom," he said before she could even offer a greeting. "Everyone at school is sending me this article. Is this really you? You never told me you could play piano like that." Maria sat down slowly at her small kitchen table, gripping the phone tightly. "It was a long time ago," she admitted quietly. "I did not think it mattered anymore." "It matters," Lucas said firmly, his tone carrying a seriousness that surprised her. "Mom, this is incredible. Why did you never tell me?" Maria hesitated, searching for words that could explain years of quiet sacrifice without sounding like a complaint. "I chose a different path," she said finally. "I chose you, and your sisters, and keeping our family steady. Music felt like something I had to leave behind to do that properly." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Lucas spoke again, his voice softer now. "Maybe you do not have to choose anymore," he said. "Maybe it is finally your turn." The conversation stayed with Maria long after the call ended, echoing quietly in her mind as she moved through the rest of her day. That evening, while preparing dinner alone in her small apartment, she found herself once again holding Charlotte Ainsworth's business card, turning it over slowly between her fingers, the weight of the decision pressing gently but persistently against her chest. The following week, Maria returned to Rosewood Hall for her usual shift, uncertain what kind of reception awaited her after the sudden attention surrounding the article. To her surprise, several members of the regular staff greeted her with warm smiles and quiet congratulations, a few even asking, half joking and half serious, whether she planned to give private lessons now that her secret had been revealed to the entire city. Daniel Whitcomb pulled her aside early in the shift, his expression thoughtful. "There is someone waiting for you in the main office," he said carefully. She said it was important. Maria made her way toward the office with growing curiosity, and upon opening the door, found Charlotte Ainsworth seated patiently inside, a folder of papers resting neatly on her lap. Charlotte rose immediately upon seeing her, offering a warm smile. "I hoped you might have had time to consider my offer," Charlotte said gently. "I understand this is a significant decision, and I do not wish to pressure you. But I truly believe the Philharmonic Showcase would be transformed by your presence." Maria sat down slowly across from her, folding her hands nervously in her lap. "I have thought about very little else," she admitted honestly. "But I am afraid. It has been so long since I performed formally. I do not know if I still have the discipline required, or the confidence." Charlotte leaned forward slightly, her expression kind but firm. "Confidence can be rebuilt," she said. "Discipline can be practiced again. But talent like yours cannot be manufactured. What you have is rare, Maria, and I would hate to see it disappear back into silence simply because fear convinced you it was not worth pursuing." Maria remained quiet for a long moment, considering the weight of those words carefully. She thought of the years spent believing her dream had ended permanently the day she missed her original audition, of the quiet grief she had carried without ever fully acknowledging it, and of the strange, unexpected joy that had filled her chest the moment her fingers had touched the piano keys again at the gala. "If I agreed," she said slowly, "what exactly would this involve?" Charlotte's expression brightened immediately, and she opened the folder resting on her lap, walking Maria carefully through the details. The Philharmonic Society, she explained, was prepared to offer Maria private lessons with an experienced instructor to help rebuild her technical skill, along with access to practice space and a formal evaluation closer to the date of the showcase. If everything progressed well, Maria would be given the opportunity to perform a short piece during the annual event, held in one of the city's most respected concert halls. "This is an incredible opportunity," Charlotte added, her tone gentle but sincere. "But it would require real commitment, regular practice, patience with yourself, and a willingness to be vulnerable again after so many years away from performing." Maria absorbed the information slowly, her mind racing through the practical realities of her life, her job, her responsibilities, the careful balance she had maintained for years simply to keep her family stable. Yet beneath those concerns, something else stirred as well, a quiet but persistent voice reminding her of the joy she had rediscovered at the piano, a joy she had convinced herself for over 2 decades she no longer had any right to feel. "I would need to keep my job here. I would need to keep my job here," she said finally, meeting Charlotte's eyes directly. "I cannot afford to give up steady income, even for something like this." Charlotte nodded immediately, clearly having anticipated the concern. "Of course," she said. "The lessons would take place during hours that do not interfere with your work schedule. This is meant to support your life, Maria, not replace it entirely." Slowly, cautiously, Maria felt something shift within her, a decision forming with quiet but unmistakable certainty. "All right," she said finally, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "I will do it." Charlotte's face lit up with genuine delight, and she reached across the small table to clasp Maria's hand warmly. "You will not regret this," she said sincerely. "I promise you that." Over the following weeks, Maria's life settled into an unfamiliar but welcome new rhythm. She continued her regular shifts at Rosewood Hall, cleaning and preparing the space for various events, just as she always had, but twice each week, she made her way to a modest practice studio across the city, where a patient instructor named Oliver Hastings guided her carefully through exercises designed to rebuild the technical foundation she had once possessed so effortlessly. The early sessions proved difficult. Her fingers, though still carrying traces of muscle memory from her years of training, struggled at times to keep pace with the more demanding passages Oliver introduced. Her hands ached in ways they had not in decades, and more than once, frustration threatened to overwhelm the fragile confidence she had only just begun rebuilding. "You are not competing against the pianist you used to be," Oliver reminded her gently during one particularly challenging session, noticing her visible frustration after a difficult passage. "You are simply becoming the pianist you are now, with everything life has taught you since then." Maria took his words to heart, slowly learning to approach her practice with patience rather than the harsh self-criticism that had crept in during the early days. Gradually, her fingers regained their former agility, old techniques resurfacing with increasing ease, while new depth crept into her playing, A depth born not from technical mastery alone but from decades of lived experience, hardship, and quiet resilience. News of her story continued spreading throughout the city in the weeks following the initial article, small local segments occasionally mentioning the remarkable cleaning woman rediscovering her musical talent after more than 20 years away from the piano. Maria remained largely private about the attention, preferring to focus her energy on the demanding work of preparation rather than the growing curiosity surrounding her unexpected journey. Richard Colton, still visibly humbled by the events of that evening, reached out unexpectedly through Charlotte one afternoon, requesting permission to make a private donation toward Maria's continued lessons and practice expenses, hoping in some small way to make amends for his earlier behavior. Maria, though initially hesitant, eventually accepted the gesture, recognizing in it a genuine effort at growth rather than simple guilt. As the date of the Philharmonic Showcase drew steadily closer, Maria found herself standing once again at a crossroads remarkably similar to the one she had faced more than 2 decades earlier, except this time, she was determined not to let fear or circumstance quietly steal the opportunity away from her without a fight. Not every week passed smoothly. One evening, after a particularly exhausting shift at the hall followed immediately by a demanding practice session, Maria arrived home to find herself overwhelmed by a wave of doubt so strong it nearly convinced her to abandon the entire pursuit. Her hands ached, her mind felt clouded with exhaustion, and the piece Oliver had assigned for the showcase, a demanding composition far more difficult than anything she had attempted since her youth, felt impossibly out of reach. She sat alone at her kitchen table that night, staring at the folded sheet music resting in front of her, memories of her missed audition decades earlier rising uninvited to the surface. What if history repeated itself, she wondered quietly. What if she poured months of effort and hope into this new opportunity, only to have life once again intervene, pulling the dream away, just as it had before? Her daughter, Camila, found her sitting there later that evening, noticing immediately the tension gathered across her mother's shoulders. Camila, still in high school, had grown up hearing only vague references to her mother's youth, never fully understanding until recently just how significant the piano had once been in her life. "You look tired," Camila said gently, pulling out the chair beside her mother and sitting down. "I am tired," Maria admitted honestly, surprising herself with the vulnerability of the confession, tired, and a little afraid. Camila studied her mother carefully before speaking again. "Afraid of what exactly?" Maria hesitated, searching for the right words. "Afraid that I am too old for this," she said finally. "Afraid that this opportunity came too late, and that no matter how hard I try, I will disappoint everyone who has placed their faith in me, including myself." Camila reached over and took her mother's hand firmly. "Mom," she said, her voice carrying a wisdom that seemed to stretch beyond her years. "You spent our whole lives teaching us that it is never too late to try something difficult, as long as it matters enough to us. Does this matter to you?" Maria felt tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes as she nodded slowly. "More than I ever let myself admit," she whispered. "Then that is your answer," Camila said simply, squeezing her mother's hand gently before rising to retrieve a glass of water for her, leaving Maria alone once again with her thoughts, though considerably lighter than before. The following week, Maria returned to her lessons with renewed determination, approaching the difficult passage that had frustrated her so deeply with fresh patience rather than fear. Oliver noticed the shift immediately, commenting quietly that something in her playing had changed, a newfound steadiness settling into her performance that had not been present in earlier sessions. As the weeks continued passing, Maria's confidence grew steadily alongside her technical skill. She began arriving early to her lessons, staying later than required, driven not by obligation but by a genuine hunger to reclaim every ounce of the passion she had set aside so many years earlier. Her fingers grew stronger, her memory sharper, and the demanding composition that had once felt impossibly out of reach slowly began transforming beneath her hands into something she could recognize as genuinely her own. One quiet afternoon, Lucas surprised her by arriving unannounced at the practice studio, having taken a break from his studies specifically to hear his mother play in person for the first time. He sat quietly near the back of the small room, watching with an expression of quiet awe, as Maria worked carefully through her piece, correcting small errors with patient determination, her focus unwavering despite his unexpected presence. When she finished, he approached slowly, his eyes slightly damp with emotion he had not expected to feel. "I always knew you were strong, Mom," he said softly, "but I never knew you were this talented too." Maria smiled warmly, reaching out to embrace her son tightly. "Strength and talent are not so different," she said gently. "Both require you to keep going, even when it feels impossible." With the showcase now just weeks away, Maria felt something settle firmly within her, a quiet but unshakable resolve that had not existed within her during the uncertain days immediately following the gala. Whatever happened on the night of the performance, she understood clearly now that simply reaching this point, reclaiming a piece of herself she had once believed permanently lost, was already a victory far greater than any single evening on a concert stage could measure. The night of the Philharmonic Showcase arrived with a chill in the autumn air, the concert hall glowing warmly against the darkening sky, as guests filed steadily through its grand entrance. Maria stood backstage dressed simply in a deep blue gown Charlotte had helped her select weeks earlier, her hands clasped tightly together as she listened to the muffled sound of the audience settling into their seats beyond the heavy velvet curtain. Her heart pounded steadily against her chest, nerves tangled tightly with anticipation. This was nothing like the unplanned moment at Rosewood Hall months earlier, where she had simply allowed instinct to guide her fingers without time to consider the consequences. Tonight, every guest in attendance had come specifically to witness this performance, aware of her story, expecting something remarkable, and the weight of that expectation pressed heavily against her resolve. Oliver Hastings found her backstage moments before she was scheduled to walk out, offering a reassuring smile as he adjusted the strap of her small clutch bag resting nearby. "You have prepared for this," he said calmly. "Trust your hands. They already know exactly what to do." Charlotte appeared shortly after, her expression bright with excitement and pride. "The hall is full," she said, practically bouncing with anticipation. "Completely full. Word of your story has traveled further than any of us expected." Maria managed a nervous smile, though her stomach continued twisting with anxious energy. "I am glad," she said quietly, and terrified. Charlotte squeezed her shoulder gently. "That is completely normal," she reassured her. "Every great performer feels exactly what you are feeling right now. It simply means this moment matters to you." Backstage, Maria caught sight of her children sitting in the front row through a small gap in the curtain. Lucas dressed neatly in a borrowed suit, Camila practically vibrating with excitement beside him. Nearby, Edward Bryant sat proudly, having insisted on attending despite his advancing age, determined not to miss witnessing his former student finally reclaim the stage she had been denied so many years earlier. Even Richard Colton had arrived, seated quietly toward the back of the hall, his presence a quiet testament to the genuine growth he had experienced since that fateful evening months earlier. Grace Whitfield sat beside him, having become an unlikely but steady supporter of Maria's journey in the months following the gala. As the lights inside the hall dimmed and the murmuring audience gradually fell silent, Maria took one final steadying breath before stepping out from behind the curtain, the bright stage lights washing warmly over her as she made her way toward the grand piano positioned center stage. Applause rippled gently through the audience as she appeared, warm and encouraging rather than the mocking laughter that had greeted her months earlier at Rosewood Hall. She offered a small, grateful bow before settling carefully onto the bench, taking a moment to steady her breathing, as silence gradually settled once again over the expectant crowd. She placed her fingers gently against the keys, closing her eyes briefly, allowing herself one final moment to remember everything that had brought her to this exact point. The mocking invitation that had unexpectedly cracked open a door she believed permanently sealed, the months of demanding practice that had rebuilt not just her technical skill but her confidence, and the quiet, unwavering support of her children who had reminded her, at the moment she needed it most, that it was never too late to reach for something that truly mattered. Then, she began to play. The opening notes rose gently into the hall, delicate and precise, carrying immediately the unmistakable mark of serious mastery. Unlike her earlier performance, born from raw, unplanned emotion, this rendition carried the careful precision of months of dedicated preparation, each phrase shaped deliberately, each dynamic shift executed with confident control. Yet beneath that precision remained the same emotional depth that had first captivated the crowd at Rosewood Hall, a depth born not from technical perfection alone, but from decades of lived experience, sacrifice, and quiet resilience. The piece built steadily, rising through complex, demanding passages that Maria navigated with growing assurance, her fingers moving fluidly across the keys, as though the difficult months of practice had simply melted away into effortless memory. The audience remained utterly still, captivated entirely by the performance unfolding before them. Several guests visibly moved to tears by the emotional intensity carried within every note. Lucas watched his mother with open pride, while Camila gripped his arm tightly, her eyes shining with unshed tears of her own. Edward Bryant sat with his hands clasped tightly together, watching the culmination of a talent he had recognized in a young girl more than 3 decades earlier finally reach the stage it had always deserved. As the piece approached its powerful conclusion, Maria's hands moved with growing intensity, the music swelling into a final, triumphant passage that seemed to gather every emotion of her journey into a single, breathtaking crescendo. The final chord rang out clear and strong through the concert hall, hanging in the air for a suspended moment, before Maria lifted her hands gently away from the keys. Silence held for only a heartbeat before the entire hall erupted into thunderous applause, guests rising quickly to their feet in a standing ovation that seemed to stretch endlessly, the sound washing over Maria in waves as she sat quietly at the piano, tears finally slipping freely down her cheeks after months of carefully controlled emotion. She rose slowly from the bench, offering a deep, grateful bow as the applause continued, her eyes finding her children immediately in the front row, both of them clapping fiercely, their faces bright with pride. Edward rose from his seat as well, applauding with visible emotion, while nearby, even Richard Colton stood among the cheering crowd, his earlier mockery transformed completely into genuine admiration. Backstage afterward, Maria was met with an overwhelming flood of congratulations, hands reaching out to shake hers, faces she recognized from the original gala now beaming with warmth rather than the cool indifference or amusement she remembered from that first uncertain evening months earlier. Charlotte embraced her tightly, practically breathless with excitement. "That was extraordinary," Charlotte said, her voice thick with emotion. "Truly extraordinary. I have never seen an audience respond quite like that." In the days following the showcase, Maria's story spread further than she ever could have anticipated, local news segments expanding into wider regional coverage, her performance shared repeatedly online. Viewers moved deeply by both the artistry of her playing and the remarkable journey that had led her back to the stage after more than 2 decades away. She received messages from strangers across the country, many sharing their own stories of dreams set aside due to circumstance, finding unexpected hope in her example. Despite the sudden attention, Maria remained remarkably grounded, continuing her work at Rosewood Hall for several more months, unwilling to abandon the stability that had carried her family safely through so many difficult years. Daniel Whitcomb, proud beyond words of his longtime employee, gently encouraged her eventually to consider a change, recognizing that her talents had clearly outgrown the scope of her current position. It was Edward who ultimately proposed the idea that would shape the next chapter of Maria's journey most meaningfully. Several months after the showcase, he approached her with a gentle suggestion, one that combined her rediscovered passion for music with a desire she had quietly nurtured throughout the entire experience, to ensure that other, overlooked, underestimated talents never had to wait as long as she had to be given a genuine chance. With Edward's guidance and a modest grant secured through Charlotte's connections at the Philharmonic Society, Maria began teaching piano lessons twice a week at a small community center located in one of the city's less affluent neighborhoods, offering free instruction to children whose families could never otherwise afford formal musical training. She approached each lesson with the same patience Oliver had once shown her, careful never to make any student feel small or unworthy, simply because of where they came from or what resources their family possessed. Among her earliest students was a quiet, serious young girl named Sophie, whose mother worked long hours cleaning offices across the city much as Maria once had. Sophie showed remarkable promise from her very first lesson, her small fingers moving across the keys with a natural curiosity that reminded Maria vividly of herself at that same age, decades earlier. "You have real talent," Maria told her gently during one of their early sessions, watching Sophie's face light up with quiet pride at the simple, sincere compliment. "Never let anyone convince you that where you come from determines how far you are allowed to go." As months passed, Maria eventually reduced her hours at Rosewood Hall, splitting her time instead between select paid performances arranged through the Philharmonic Society and her continued teaching work at the community center, a balance that felt, for the first time in decades, entirely true to who she was. Nearly a year after that unexpected evening at Rosewood Hall, the same charity gala returned once again to the very same venue, and this time, Maria was invited not as staff, but as an honored guest performer, asked specifically to close the evening's program with a piece of her choosing. She arrived dressed elegantly, greeted warmly by familiar faces, including Grace Whitfield, who embraced her immediately with genuine affection, and Richard Colton, who approached quietly to express, once again, how deeply grateful he remained for the lesson she had unknowingly taught him that night. As Maria took her place at the same piano where her extraordinary journey had first begun, now polished carefully and properly tuned in preparation for the performance, she glanced briefly toward the crowd gathered before her, noticing among the familiar faces of donors and guests a small group of her students from the community center, seated proudly near the front, Sophie among them, eyes wide with excitement at the sight of her teacher preparing to perform. Maria smiled warmly before settling onto the bench, placing her fingers gently against the keys she now knew as intimately as she once had in her youth. As she began to play, filling the grand hall once again with music carrying every ounce of hardship, resilience, and quiet hope that had defined her remarkable journey, she understood clearly that this moment was no longer simply about reclaiming something she had lost decades earlier. It had become something far greater, proof that talent, dignity, and dreams could never truly be measured by a person's job title, their circumstances, or the assumptions strangers carelessly placed upon them, and that sometimes, the most unexpected moments held the power to completely transform not only one life, but countless others watching quietly, waiting patiently for their own chance to finally be seen. After the final note faded and the applause rose once more around her, Maria remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, allowing herself to fully absorb the weight of how far she had traveled since the last time she had touched this particular piano, beneath these same chandeliers. She thought of the woman she had been that night, gripping her cleaning cart tightly, certain her only role in this grand hall was to remain unseen and unheard. That woman felt distant now, though Maria carried her gently within herself still, grateful rather than ashamed of every hour spent scrubbing floors and polishing silverware to keep her family steady. Backstage after the performance, Sophie's mother approached Maria shyly, a woman named Renata Diaz who worked long shifts cleaning downtown offices much as Maria once had. She held her daughter's hand tightly, her eyes glistening with quiet emotion, as she thanked Maria for the opportunity she had given Sophie, an opportunity Renata admitted she never could have afforded on her own. "You have given her something I could not," Renata said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "Not just lessons, belief. She talks about you constantly, about wanting to play the way you played that night everyone saw the video online." Maria knelt down gently to Sophie's height, placing a warm hand on the young girl's shoulder. "You do not need permission to believe in yourself," she told her softly. "But if hearing it from someone else helps, then I believe in you completely, and I will keep believing in you for as long as you are willing to keep practicing." Sophie beamed, throwing her small arms briefly around Maria's waist before her mother gently guided her toward the exit, both of them glancing back one final time with grateful smiles before disappearing into the crowded hallway. Isabel Carter, the reporter who had first written about Maria's remarkable story nearly a year earlier, approached quietly once the crowd had thinned, notebook once again in hand, though her expression now carried the familiarity of someone who had followed this journey closely, rather than encountering it for the first time. She asked gently whether Maria might be willing to share a few thoughts for a follow-up piece marking the anniversary of that first unexpected performance. Maria agreed readily, settling into a quiet corner of the now emptying hall as Isabel prepared her notebook. Looking back, Isabel asked carefully, "What would you say to the version of yourself standing at that piano bench for the first time, not knowing what was about to happen?" Maria considered the question thoughtfully before answering, her gaze drifting briefly toward the piano still resting center stage. "I would tell her not to be afraid of being seen," she said finally. "For so many years, I believed that staying quiet and unnoticed was the safest way to protect myself and my family. I did not realize how much I had also been hiding a part of myself that deserved space to exist too." Isabel wrote quickly, nodding along thoughtfully. "And what would you say to others out there," she asked, "who might be sitting on a talent or a dream they believe it is too late to pursue?" Maria smiled softly, a quiet certainty settling clearly across her features. "I would tell them that circumstances can delay a dream," she said, "but they cannot destroy it, not unless we allow them to. Mine waited over 20 years for me to return to it. It never once stopped waiting." The interview concluded shortly after, Isabel thanking her warmly before gathering her things and heading toward the exit, already composing the shape of her article in her mind as she walked. Maria remained a while longer in the quiet hall, watching as the remaining staff began the familiar work of clearing tables and folding chairs, tasks she herself had performed countless times in this very space. Daniel Whitcomb approached her one final time before the evening fully ended, a warm smile spreading across his face as he glanced around the hall now returning slowly to its usual quiet order. "It is strange seeing you on that side of the room instead of pushing a cart through it," he said kindly. Maria laughed softly, shaking her head. "Some nights I still expect to be handed a mop the moment I walk through those doors," she admitted. "Old habits take a long time to fully let go." Daniel studied her for a moment, his expression turning more serious. "For what it is worth," he said sincerely, "I always respected the work you did here, long before any of this happened. I just wanted you to know that." Maria reached out and squeezed his hand gratefully. "That means more than you know." she said softly. As she finally stepped out into the cool night air outside Rosewood Hall, her children waiting nearby with the car, Maria paused for a brief moment on the front steps, glancing back one final time at the glowing windows of the building that had quietly shaped so much of her life, first as a place of survival, then unexpectedly as the setting for her most remarkable transformation. She thought of all the ordinary evenings she had spent within those walls, unnoticed and unremarkable to nearly everyone around her, never once imagining that one small, mocking invitation would eventually crack open a door she had sealed shut decades earlier out of necessity rather than choice. She thought of Sophie, and the dozens of other students who had since found their way into her small classroom at the community center, each of them carrying their own quiet talents, waiting patiently, as she once had, for someone to finally take notice. Lucas leaned out of the car window, calling gently for her to hurry before the cold air chilled her fully. Maria smiled, taking one final breath of the crisp evening air, before making her way down the steps toward her waiting family, carrying with her not just the memory of tonight's performance, but the quiet, unshakable understanding that some doors, no matter how long they remain closed, are always simply waiting for the right moment to be opened again.